Hello, that's a long 2 minutes.
Ravi sir, you may start now.
All right,
Good
Ravi.
evening. Good evening, everybody. My name is Ravi Agarwal. I'm the guest editor for the issue of the ISE Quarterly dealing with climate change called Weather Report. Uh, Today we will launch this ISE Quarterly formally online. But alongside, we also have a panel discussion with two eminent panelists. The issue will be launched by Dr. Karan Singh, who needs no introduction, but I will, of course, tell you a little bit more about him in a moment. Uh, Before we start, I just like to make a few points about the quarterly, this particular issue, which was released, which is being released today on climate change. As we know that the question of climate change is very pertinent because it is about keeping the temperature and the CO2 emissions at a certain level which does not exceed it by 2050. Lots of things have happened in the past years which are very encouraging. There are falling prices of non-fossil fuel energy. There is a move towards decarbonization by many companies, by many governments, and there are many regulations which are being put into place. However, we have a long way to go to be able to avoid the 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature rise. This issue of the quarterly examines the mainstream debates, of course, which are to do with policy and politics, India's approaches and impacts in South Asia, through some very key voices. But it also takes a multi-sectoral approach. Part of the problem of climate change is that it is like what Timothy Morton, the philosopher, calls hyperobjects. It is everywhere but not recognized. In this journal, we have invited sector experts to reflect on the climate change issue and think about how the landscape they work in are being impacted. It is a grounds-up approach of including voices of those who are researching landscapes and observing changes in them across disciplines and practices. For example, what happens in forests, in agriculture, in wildlife, in the health sector, in the electricity sector, coastlines, rural water, urban waste, security, gender, etc. And by doing this, it is trying to examine observations by experts where there might not be very formal data already existing. We know, despite all these many years of talks about climate change does not figure very prominently as central to development policies. For example, in the way we plan our waterways or think of green jobs or coastal impacts or coastal livelihoods. In that sense, it's not yet a political term. And in a developing country context, very important for something to be embedded in the development discourse for it to take a real public move. Like COVID-19, and it has very similar roots of nature destruction, and the roots extend everywhere. For example, vulnerable populations, particularly considered in India, in the vast geographical size and the huge population involved, have a very wide cultural diversity, which require a very differentiated approach at response to climate change impacts. Another aspect of vulnerabilities is through the widespread environmental changes predicted by the term we now call the Anthropocene, which are not all contained within the central climate change discourse, which is largely centered on decarbonization of economies, habitat loss, loss of biodiversity, rapid extinction of non-human animals, excessive mining, marine plastics and other waste, water scarcity, and overall deterioration of ecosystems. So these are issues which this volume is trying to cover. It has also taken another approach, which is often missed out in science and policy circles. These include voices of those practitioners who have a holistic or alternate or a literary or through the literary and the literature and arts perspective, as well as the grassroots movements perspective, such as the climate justice movements. So we have invited in this volume poets, dancers, interdisciplinary approach people who work with interdisciplinary approaches and holistic approaches and Gandhian perspectives, for example. And we want to know how these practitioners think of ecological and climate crisis. So we have tried to put together a rooted and a kind of speculative, but also trying to speak across many kinds of audiences, because communication is a key part of how we're going to tackle the climate crisis. With these words, I'd like to quickly now start the process. I'd like to invite the Honorable Dr. Karan Singh, whom all of us know, but still to say that, of course, he's had a very long political career. He was member of Rajya Sabha from 2000 to 2018. He's the author of Distinction, written books on political science, philosophical essays, travelogues, and poems. He's an environmentalist and educationist and has been chancellor of at least 3 universities. Dr. Karan Singh was awarded the Padma Vibhushan in 2005, and he's here as chairman of the editorial board of the IIC Quarterly. So thank you very much, sir, for joining us. There couldn't be a better person than you to launch this particular volume. So I'm really grateful to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, our co-editor, Ravi Agarwal, and our panelist, Nagraj Adve, and Ruchira Talukdar, all the way from Melbourne. Welcome, all of you. First, the good news. America is going to rejoin the Paris Accord. And that, I think, is going to be a major breakthrough, because the world's most polluting nation had pulled out of the accord, which had been hammered out over so many meetings and so many years. And so it's good that America is coming back, hopefully, into the Paris Accord. Every year, what we do is, as you know, in IIC, in our journal, we choose one particular topic which we think is of importance, and we have a double issue on it. And over the decades, we've had a number of these double issues, and many of them have become books and have become collector's items. We've had a lot of important issues, but it seems to me that this issue that we're going to launch today is probably the most important issue that we've ever done. Because as Ravi has said, the climate change is something now that is upon us. It has happened before our eyes. It's not as if something is theoretical that can happen. It's happened. We've seen the oceans rising. We've seen these erratic weather events. And we've seen the way millions of plants and animals and aquatic species are disappearing, and deforestation, and the rise of CO2 emissions, and the whole planet heating up. Those terrible pictures of glaciers actually melting before our eyes. The polar bears now wandering around disoriented because their habitat has disappeared. So this climate change is something which all of us are seeing. We are living through it. Whether we are reacting accordingly or not, I don't know. Because I don't think, as Ravi said, this has not yet entered the center of our consciousness. It's still peripheral, but all efforts have been made to make it central. I go back 38 years. Stockholm, the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. I was there. I was on Mrs. Gandhi's delegation. She was heading the delegation, and Olof Palme was heading the Swedish delegation. Only 2 heads of government were there. And then 20 years later in Rio, there were over 100 heads of government. So all sorts of efforts have been made, but I don't think that we have really done as much as we can do, or as we should do. Now, the Anthropocene age, this is another very interesting new term, an Anthropocene age, in which human activity will determine the future of the planet. This is something new. We've begun on a very ominous note, and if we continue the way we are doing now, then the next 3 or 4 decades could see many countries actually disappearing beneath the ocean, because they are just marginal. The ocean is rising steadily. I think at least half a dozen ocean countries are going to disappear altogether. And even the larger countries, ports, for example, I believe even Bombay or Calcutta, they can be flooded. And the sort of ecological refugees that will be created as a result of these climate change is something we have to keep in mind. Um, I think India has a special responsibility. As somebody says, one of our authors says here, I don't know if he says a good thing, India's moment to lead the world to sustainability is here. I think that's tremendously important because we are 1/7 of the human race. We have a rich cultural support. Remember that. Conservation is something that goes back thousands of years. You take the Atharva Veda. There is a Bhumi Suktam in the Atharva Vedas, 63 verses, which I think represent the most holistic articulation of environmental values that you will find anywhere in the world. So we have this tradition. We have the tradition that trees are sacred, vriksh nahi kaatna chahiye. They're sacred pools, they're sacred ponds, rivers, and all. We were supposed to worship them because this was a way in which we were taught to value and respect the environment. That is beginning now to disappear, but I think we have got to recapture that. Because we do not believe that we've been born here to have sovereignty over every other creature. That's not true. We are part of nature. We are part of this whole evolutionary process over 2 billion years that has thrown up the tiger as well as us. And so we have a responsibility because we are the only ones who have the consciousness to be able to understand the problem. So we have to do that. India has to have a massive educational campaign to make the environment and its crisis known to people. Children have to be taught. They have to be taught to nurture the environment, to respect the environment. Wherever possible, they should be taken out into nature so that they can interact and gain something from it. So it's really, I think, extraordinary. You know what struck me particularly, and all of you saw that. I don't know what happened in Melbourne, but here when we had this COVID, the first lockdown, suddenly the skies became blue. I hadn't seen blue skies in Delhi. I came to Delhi, what was it, 53 years ago, and I have not seen any blue skies all these years. Suddenly you see the beautiful blue skies, and the flowers came out again, and the butterflies came out. It was remarkable what the lack of human activity could do for nature. I mean, you talk of Anthropocene. This is a classic example of what non-activity by human beings can achieve. And now what we have to do by our activity, we've got to achieve this. As was mentioned, what we need is a big boost for non-polluting technologies. Solar, we have so much sun. We've been worshipping the sun. The Gayatri mantra is devoted to the sun. We've been worshipping the sun for thousands of years, but now we can use it. I think solar power is perhaps the key to our development and to cutting down our polluting gases. Wind power also, in places like Ladakh and so on. These huge windmills have been put up. So alternative power, alternative energy, and conservation of nature and of species, this is tremendously important. I would like, on behalf of the editorial board, which I have chaired for many years now, I'd like to thank Ravi Agarwal, our co-editor. The editor herself is apparently couldn't appear because her mother's down with COVID. And so Ravi Agarwal is introduced it very well. And our two panelists, Nagraj Adve, who is a member of Teachers Against Climate Crisis. That's a new one. I hadn't heard that before. But good wishes to you. Ruchira Talukdar, as I said, who is joining us all the way from Melbourne. So I think what we now need to do is, if we're going to release the book, shall we all hold it up to the screen? Shall we do that now? Do you all have the book? Nagraj ji, kitab pagdiye. Take the book.
Yeah, in fact, we didn't receive the hard copies, but
Yes, of course. So we
congratulations.
just sum it up. Which is a hard copy, but I
A
will
wonderful,
definitely do the
wonderful.
hard copy. Here's
Yeah,
the formal
wonderful.
release. The formal release of this quarterly, which I hope will become very popular, not only for IIC members but around the country and around the world. Good luck. Okay, now I think our panelists can start, and who's starting? Nagraj is starting as member of Teachers Against Climate Crisis. I think that's a lovely acronym tag.
Thank you, thank you. It's about a year old. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Karan Singh, for those really insightful words and to bringing the discussion up to date, starting with the American, what's happening in the US, and bringing in the idea of the Anthropocene and COVID. So I think these are really important markers in what's happening today. I'd like to just formally, quickly introduce our two panelists. Dr. Karan Singh has already mentioned the names. Mr. Nagraj Adve is a member of Teachers Against Climate Crisis, a very active group called the TACC, and the South Asian collective, SAPACC, South Asian, I guess, program for, he'll have to tell us what ACC stands for. His work, Global Warming in India, an overview, has been translated into Hindi, Kannada, Tamil, Gujarati, and Telugu. He has published pieces on climate change in the EPW, the Economic and Political Weekly, Science and Society, the Hindu, the India Forum, Wire, Himal, and other publications. And we have been friends for a long time, Nagraj, so thank you very much for joining us today. I'd also, so as not to interrupt later, after Nagraj has spoken, I'd like to invite then Ruchira Talukdar, who's coming to us from all the way from Melbourne. Thank you, Ruchira, for joining us from Australia. She's a doctoral candidate in social sciences at the University of Technology, Sydney, and a researcher at the UTS Climate Justice Research Centre. Her thesis, which she's just submitted, she told us yesterday, is an ethnographic comparison of anti-coal movements in Singrauli, Madhya Pradesh, infamously known as India's energy capital, and Australia, through the opposition to the Carmichael coal mine. Ruchira has over 10 years experience in environmental advocacy with NGOs in India and Australia, such as Greenpeace and the Australian Conservation Foundation. She's also a regular writer and contributor on environmental politics in New Matilda and newsclick.in. So we are promised a very interesting half an hour of insights. I now hand the mic to Nagraj for his presentation.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Ravi. And thank you for inviting me to be a speaker today for the release of this very important special issue of the IIC Quarterly. So since we were last supposed to have this talk in mid-September, this event, there have been two very significant changes in the climate change landscape. One, of course, as Dr. Karan Singh referred to, was Joe Biden becoming president-elect and promising a reversal of Trump's policies and the very likelihood of the US joining the Paris Agreement. But even more important from a climate change point of view is China's declaration on 22nd September that China would peak its annual carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and become carbon neutral by 2060. But before I start, I would like to congratulate both the editors, Ravi Agarwal and Omita Goyal, for bringing together a very fine set of writers and a very high quality series of essays. It's usually collected volumes tend to be uneven, but this particular collection is remarkable for the sheer consistent quality of the writing. So first of all, I'm very glad to see the term crisis, the title of the issue, because that's a term actually that we have used for the last 2 or 3 years. And two recent landmark reports provide insights into why the term climate crisis is appropriate. So the IPCC and the WMO released a report, United in Science, in early September. And among its key findings is that there's a chance of at least, and I'm quoting, there's a chance of at least 1 year exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 5 years. And the chance of that is 24%. And that, as we know, is part of the Paris Agreement sort of targets. And also, with this particular report, for the first time since I began to follow climate change seriously 15 years ago, I began to think of sea level rise in terms of centimeters and not just millimeters. It is currently rising by about 0.5 centimeters every single year, according to this report. In India, there was another landmark report that was released in June by the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology in Pune, the IITM. And that report argues that India has warmed by about 0.7 degrees Celsius since 1901, but also says that the warming in India has been masked. That is to say, it would be higher. It's been masked by aerosol air pollution, and its absence would probably be half a degree Celsius warmer. It also argues that there's been a long-term decline in the summer monsoons by 6% since 1951. And the main reason for that is global warming, and particularly because the Indian Ocean is getting warmer. Now, these are climatic changes. Its impacts are, of course, felt in the social context of increasing inequality. And some of those impacts on health in India were discussed with great insight in the collected volume by Soumya Swaminathan and Purnima Prabhakaran in their essay, The Future of Health in a Climate Crisis. And this includes, they say, the spread of dengue and chikungunya 3 or 4 times as much because the conditions are now more conducive. A second class of impacts, which usually is not talked about sufficiently, is how other species are being impacted. I'm very glad that this volume also includes essays, and in particular, a fascinating essay on elephants by Professor Raman Sukumar. I must add that an untold number of species in India are already being hit by the forced shift in their geographical location, what's called shift in range, and in the timing of life cycle events, phenological changes, and other effects of greater heat stress, etc. So, given the context of a climate crisis and one that is growing each year, how are we doing domestically and how are we doing internationally? So, domestically, notwithstanding the expansion of solar, wind, and other renewables, in my view, India's 3 key targets in the NDC are too modest. The target 1 of reducing its emissions in a relative sense, 30 to 35% relative to GDP, largely continues the earlier trajectory of the earlier decade. The second target of achieving 40% of our total electricity capacity from non-fossil fuels, again by 2030. So data from the CEA from 10 days ago, which I just checked this morning, suggests that we are at 38% already. So 141 gigawatts out of our current capacity of 373 gigawatts is from non-fossil fuels, which mind you includes hydro, nuclear, etc. So basically we should reach 40% in about 2 years. And there's 2 ways, 8 years ahead of time. So there are 2 ways we can look at it. One, of course, is that it reflects our remarkable expansion in renewables in recent years, but also the fact that our second target is simply too modest. We could have had a much higher target, right? And our third claim that our forests and trees will sequester an additional 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030 is in fact a contestable claim. As Sharad Lele argued in an essay in a volume edited by Nagraj Adve last year, brought by OOP. So my hope is that, so even though India is not required to submit an NDC this year, revised NDC, because only those with 5-year NDCs are required to do so, one hopes that India will in fact submit a far more ambitious NDC, and in fact one that will be unconditional. And the key reason for that to do so, as many essays in this volume show, that Indian people are being already massively hit by the climate crisis and also other species. And the point also is that we wish to claim a moral high ground internationally. We need to make a significant progression and need to do so unconditionally, which brings us to the international stage. So as Nagraj Adve and Lavanya Rajamani have correctly argued, in the first essay in this volume, there's been a shift in key countries such as Brazil, US, and Australia, and it really is a shift to the political right. So what they refer to as a leadership and imagination vacuum in climate politics at the global level. But they also suggest that India and China fill that vacuum. To me, that is a pretty rosy view. I mean, of course, the essay was written before the US elections, but even so. Now the US, it's been such a huge issue in recent days being reported worldwide. And undoubtedly, as Dr. Karan Singh says, we need to welcome the fact that the new administration will very likely join the Paris Agreement. Joe Biden's website, the campaign website, talked about his government potentially investing $1.5 trillion in clean energy. It makes more likely that there'll be a check on methane emissions. It's more likely that they'll enable electric vehicles and install tens of thousands of charging points for them. Some reporting has talked to the fact that the US will proclaim a net zero emissions target by 2050. Now, all of these are extremely welcome things. But there are a couple of things that are worrying. One, as Professor Robert Paulin argued in a talk that we had organized, our group had organized a few weeks ago, Biden also pushes very much for fracking, which in many ways is environmentally damaging. There are three things that are worrying. One is the fracking. Secondly, the general expansion of natural gas, which is part of the US energy shift. And third, it's very likely that they will export fossil fuels if they don't use them. So they'll export oil to places like India, and they will export natural gas to places like China, which is what they've been doing because you can now freeze natural gas, supercool it, and then transport it in tankers. These are slightly worrying things. The other part is that there are ongoing energy shifts in the US that are important. And incidentally, I must point out that there, during the Trump years, during these 4 years, there actually was a slight decline in US carbon dioxide emissions. It probably sort of stagnated in these 4 years. And that's partly because of the shift of the US from coal to greater gas because of shale gas. But however, there was a significant rise in the US emissions of methane, and it's more difficult to sort of measure methane in the atmosphere. Quickly moving to China because of time limitations, China made a very significant sort of declaration that I declared earlier. And that the details were spelled out not by the government, but by a study by Tsinghua University. So Tsinghua University said that Chinese power generation will nearly double by 2060 to 16.4 terawatts, with electricity making up 80% of total energy consumption. Nuclear power would amplify 4 times, and there will also be a massive expansion of solar, nuclear, and wind, while coal declined very significantly by 96%. This at least is their promise, right? And so they've said they'll peak CO2 emissions by 2030. However, there are two questions with China. One, is the target of 2060 too far out? I mean, it's like 40 years away, and as some people have pointed out, they could have had sort of more interim sort of targets in this respect. And secondly, how does it actually again address structural factors, and in particular two things: the manufacturing that's expanded in China in the last 15 years, that is currently shifting to a slight degree as manufacturing moves a bit to Vietnam and the Near East, and also as some governments and or companies talking about slightly moving out of China. That will take a while. But there's one structural factor, which is manufacturing. And secondly, the level of urbanization. Mind you that China's carbon dioxide emissions from cement use and urbanization in just 3 years, between 2013 or so, was more than the entire emissions from the US in the entire 20th century. That process of urbanization sort of carries on. So how will the Chinese targets essentially tackle these two structural factors or constraints? And finally, I must just say this: the Chinese economy and emissions are so large that I think we need to rethink our entire architecture of basic. It's something that I can elaborate in the discussion for want of time. And finally, let me just say this: will there be more pressure on political elites for greater action? Movementally, what is happening? Undoubtedly, there's been a rise of young people worldwide in the last 2 years, particularly in Europe, England, and other places. In India, too, there's been, and I'm in touch with some of these groups, there's been a significant expansion of XR and Fridays for Future in a number of towns, and there's undoubtedly a greater awareness and to some degree understanding of the climate crisis, and some of them are linked to other environmental concerns, for instance, the current EIA amendment. The however, though, is that how it links to other movements. And I should say that, again, this issue of the ISE quarterly has two very fine chapters. Ravi Agarwal and Paulina Lopez have a fine chapter on the significance of local action, essentially in facing the challenges of climate change. That's something that Ashish Kothari and Vikalp Sangam have been focusing on. It raises one question: is local action best suited for adaptation to climate change? Whereas, and Ravi could sort of respond in the discussion. So is local action best suited for adaptation to climate change, whereas mitigation necessarily needs larger players, including the state? And at the end of the volume, Soumya Datta has an important chapter on the state of the climate movement. Incidentally, it's very difficult to write about climate movement. I mean, I've been part of the climate movement for 15 years, and there's hardly any quality writing on this. So I'm very happy about this particular essay. And writing on the politics of climate change is a bit like Einstein's relativity, because it says as much about the issue as the political location of the writer. So Soumya is a pretty valuable addition. So one comment I want to make regarding the climate movement before I conclude is that in India, it's heavily NGOized, and that has contributed to the fact that it has remained highly fragmented, despite the movement being about 25 years old. So finally, to conclude, even beginning to deal with the climate change needs, as Vandana Singh has argued in her essay, a transdisciplinary approach and dealing with the systemic economic factors that Ravi Agarwal does. I'd say let us never forget the urgency implicit in the two reports that I begin with, whether you are in the climate movement or whether you are in the corridors of power. Because being a complex system, the Earth's ecosystems are inextricably interlinked, and the time for key ecosystems like the Arctic and others is running out. Thank you once again for inviting me.
Thank you, Nagraj. Before Ruchira, I just want to make a little administrative announcement. Please, all those who are participating, if you like, you could leave questions in the chat, and we plan to take up the questions after Ruchira's presentation. Ruchira, your floor, please.
Dr. Singh has raised his hand.
No. Can you hear what I'm saying? No.
Yes, sir.
No, I just want to draw attention to the stunning painting by Aisha Sadr in this book. It's a stunning painting.
Yeah.
I mean, you should look at them. They show the plight of not only of the girl child, but of the environment itself. So let's not forget the paintings while we're looking at the text. That's what I want to say. Ruchira, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you
Can
for
you
reminding
guys,
us.
can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
I can.
Okay. I can only see this. I can't see any of you. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be on this panel. And I think I'll find it hard to follow from the wonderful and very succinct presentation that Nagraj gave. I share all of Nagraj's views on the scale and the breadth of the special climate crisis issue. So I won't repeat any of it. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. I'm based in Melbourne, and it's the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, and sovereignty was never ceded. It always will be Aboriginal land. So I'm Australia-based, and I have been here for the last 12 years, and I've had the chance to observe the climate and the environment movements in Australia transform because of the shift of governments to the right, and also because of the massive increase in coal and coal seam gas extraction. So what I want to present to you today very briefly is an arc of the transformation, and also the various other kinds of groups that have come and joined the climate movement. It's no longer kind of a white, green activists field, and classically an environmentalism of the North that many of us from the South have, kind of historically written against, and so on and so forth. So Australia is the driest inhabited continent on the planet, and we all remember images from last summer actually. We're approaching almost 1 year to the catastrophic bushfires in Victoria and New South Wales, and also in Queensland. And these kinds of bushfires have increased in intensity, as well as the scale and range in terms of how many places are burning at the same time. There's also the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, an international icon, and the Great Barrier Reef went through massive bleaching episodes in 2016 and 2017. And almost half the reef is irrecoverably damaged by now because of climate change, but also other cumulative factors. There's also record-breaking heat waves that have increased in frequency and temperatures, so much so that the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia had to add new colors to the heat map. So magenta and dark purple were new colors added 3 years back because of the increase in temperatures of the heat waves. So we have extreme climate change in Australia, but we also have is climate wars, essentially a political, media-supported and an industry fight to any form of climate action, and basically for more coal and more coal seam gas extraction. So the last 11 years, since 2007, Australia has seen a whole decade of what's called climate inertia. We have had 6 change of prime ministers and 8 change of basically heads of parties, and repealing of a climate act that was passed. So in this period, Australia has had its only female prime minister, and possibly that had nothing to do with the fact that she passed Australia's carbon tax, national kind of legislation on climate action, which was repealed by the next prime minister. Of course, the response to Julia Gillard passing the carbon tax was very much gendered. So the response to the climate, the way right-wing supporters responded to Australia's carbon tax had very much to do with her gender, but not so much the fact that she passed the carbon tax. So Tony Abbott, who came in 2013, repealed the carbon tax as he had promised in his election campaign. And from then on, Australia has seen a very strong and steady grip on federal politics by the right wing. And Tony Abbott and the Liberal Party broadly has a position of climate denialism. Along with it, Australia has also seen its biggest resource boom, and within it, its biggest coal boom. So the reason the controversy surrounding the Carmichael coal mine, Adani's coal mine in Australia, has become very central to the national debate on coal and climate change is because of these two different reasons. One is the climate denialism and hijacking of any kind of climate action by the federal government, and the other is an expansion of coal exports. The Queensland is Australia's biggest coal exporting state. It exports 90% of the coal that it extracts, and it has overtaken New South Wales, which used to be the biggest before this. Australia exports 80% of its coal. So during the last 20 years, places like the Hunter Valley and Newcastle Port, which is the world's largest coal port, have been renamed by climate activists as the Carbon Valley. And it speaks to two parallel changes that have been occurring. One is increase in climate change, and with it also social action in Australia for climate action, and simultaneously increase of coal exports. And all of these clash in same geographies. So groups rename coal regions as carbon valleys to highlight the scale of the problem. There's also the problem of coal extraction, what Naomi Klein calls in her book, This Changes Everything, the phenomena of what used to be a struggle that the poor used to have about mining, on their farms, and basically them being dispossessed for extraction is now occurring in enclaves of the rich. So we now have in Australia, as well as in the US, in the case of coal seam gas extraction, mining occurring on prime agricultural land. So the Galilee Basin, where the Carmichael mine, Adani's coal mine, is situated, became Australia's latest coal frontier. And out of the 9 mines that were proposed over there, 6 of them were going to be the biggest that Australia has ever seen. So the scale of the coal mines were increasing, even as coal was becoming more and more unviable internationally. And this was only possible because of the way Australian politics, supported by media like Rupert Murdoch-owned News Corp, which pretty much owns 80% of Australian newspapers, Australian print media. And the industry worked together to champion coal. So this is our current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. When he was the treasurer in Liberal Prime Minister Turnbull's cabinet, he passed a lump of coal around, around in Parliament, saying, "Don't be afraid, this is just a lump of coal." There's also the campaign by the industry about rebranding and renaming coal as clean coal. And along with it, Australian government and media efforts to champion Australia's coal as clean and the technology that the world needs now. And of course, these go hand in glove with industry campaigns. So Peabody Energy, the US coal mining corporation, sometimes the lines of our ex-Prime Minister Tony Abbott would exactly mirror the campaigns of Peabody, and you couldn't tell the difference between which is which. And of course, there is the champion of the Carmichael Adani coal mine in jingoistic and racist ways that only happen with certain newspapers like the Australian. So this story about Gautam Adani's dream to light up India's darkened nights, about Australian coal helping millions of Indians rise out of poverty, and another cartoon in the same newspaper about the poor breaking down solar panels and not being able to eat them, as if coal is something they could eat. So what's occurred in the last 10 years, or perhaps even in the last 20 years, is it just not environmental activists. It's also indigenous groups for land rights and farmers who have come together under the collective threat of coal and coal seam gas mining, to form a new anti-coal movement or alliance, so to speak. So farmers have a range of different issues. One of the fundamental issues of farmers is politically they do not feel represented anymore. Being conservative voters, being Liberal Party voters, they feel that they're not represented anymore. So politically they're at a loss, but what is at risk is groundwater. Australia is a dry continent. Most farmers in the interiors rely on water from underground, and mining affects that. There is also, of course, we would have sometimes seen news about the resistance of the Wangan and Jagalingu tradition owners to the Adani Carmichael mine, and the issue of land rights, again, historic dispossession and current repossession of land, a process that is not too different from India's land rights worries and struggles. But of course, this is in the first world context. So the indigenous groups around the country have come together under the banner of land rights, not mining rights. And this has probably become one of the most central justice claims against coal mining in Australia in the last 10 years. And of course, there's the environment movement, which has transformed completely from what used to be the wilderness wars of the 1980s, where they used to preserve wilderness. And it used to be all about basically national parks and biodiversity, to now collectively wanting to stop coal. So I took this image at the school strike for climate action in Melbourne last year. And coal has become the central contention of the climate movement today, across all age groups, across all representations. This is one more image from the school strikes. And of course, there is the Stop Adani movement, which is highly visible and prominent. And Adani has become the keyword for climate action in Australia, or rather stopping Adani has become the keyword for climate action in Australia. So I'm just going to... Okay, screen share is gone, right?
Yes, it's gone.
Okay, so I always feel at a loss in terms, just going to wrap up, I always feel at a loss in terms of how to compare India and Australia. But one thing that does inspire me is the way in which, again, kind of regardless of the fact that the complexity and diversity of challenges, issues that we deal with in India is phenomenally different from Australia. But what is interesting to observe is the way that groups with historical and deep and significant divisions have been able to come together in Australia. Farmers and indigenous groups are, basically the strongest example I can think of, because historically farmers were responsible in the settler colonial project for dispossessing and in the genocide of indigenous people. And it has taken extreme coal mining, to become a shared risk on the basis of which farmers and indigenous groups are now reconciling. So in a way, this is a moment, a very historical moment unfolding in Australia. And this is all in the name of now collectively climate action. So it does raise possibilities in a way for the world. It raises possibilities in a way, given that governments have swung so much to the right. Again, given the very different context we have in Australia and India, and how much more critically affected democracy can be in India, these kinds of actions might not be feasible. But there is room and space to think about basically about politicizing coal in relation to climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruchira, for that, and Nagraj earlier for that. Those two excellent presentations. Before I like to, there are some questions we have in the chat, and I'd also like to pose a question each to Ruchira and to Nagraj. But before that, I'd like to first thank IIC for inviting me to guest edit this journal, and Omita and her fabulous team, which we all worked very closely together. And unfortunately, Omita is not unavailable, but everybody else is behind the scenes. But they really hold the excellent journal, of which I've been a subscriber for many, many years together. So this time being as a guest editor has been a real honor for me. Ruchira, I'd just like to ask you one question, and then because you ended by talking about you have had experience in India as well, and you talked about the difference in context of India and Australia, but also there is this global nature of both the of the fossil fuel industry, where it comes because Australia is a big exporter of coal to India. And of course, in petrochemicals, it's changing form from gas and oil to fracking. Now, how do you see local protests and local politics in the context of dealing with a globally networked fossil fuel industry, which has deep roots, everything else? And of course, the context of protest or of opposition or even recognition of the problem is very different. So do you see anything becoming more global in that sense? Because I find some of the European protests by young students and children very effective, but also very European-based. They're not lodged in a very development country context. Would you like to react to that?
Sure. I think, I'll just go back to a couple of points that Nagraj actually made in terms of there is a lot of activity in India in terms of climate, kind of calling it a climate crisis and action by youth groups, urban youth groups, but there's also indigenous if I can call it activism, of course, in the Indian context of indigenous youth, scholars and researchers educating Adivasi communities about forest rights. So I think there are actions going on at many levels. One of the fundamental differences I find that it might still be easier for urban groups in India to connect with climate action around the rest of the world. It is the connection between urban and rural. That is the disconnect. But I also think that, previously there have been anti-globalization movements, and they have been a global phenomena. A lot of that had to do with injustices in the South. And I almost see that the new climate justice network is going to be global in that nature. Like there is conceptualization around the fact that how the new climate justice movement has to be about the struggles of people fighting coal mines. And if that is the case, then, well, we have a lot of it in India. The issue is with the disconnects that exist and how do we connect them? I have to talk about the case of Greenpeace, where I used to work before, and the fact that the organization is barely operating in India now, and the crackdown was because of its work on coal. So there are issues in the global South, there are issues with Indian democracy, and there are issues with forest rights, and those have to maybe become central in a global, which is why the indigenous resistance in Australia gives me a little hope. Because the issue of land rights and historic dispossession has become a central narrative in a collective climate movement. And one would only hope that that can happen globally and that the North and South can connect.
Thank you. Nagraj, question to you, if I may. Fossil fuels are very critical to meeting India's basic development needs. We're still a coal-based economy, and of course, hydroelectric power is taken as carbon neutral, but it has other impacts. There have been large protests against large dams and all that. So in that context, how do you see, when you talked of structural shift, you've actually posed the question to me about local groups and structural shift. What kind of structural shift is possible in a developing country like India? Is it not going to be just piecemeal? Or is there anything else which is possible, you think? Just as a speculation as well. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry, let me start again. Yeah, sorry. Before I can respond to that question, Ravi, let me just quickly respond to your earlier question to Ruchira. I think that was a very interesting one. So one reason that Biden was elected in the US is because of the very significant mobilization by young people around the climate change question. I think the US is probably the only country of its size and significance where the climate movement is politically so significant. I don't think even in Australia or certainly in India and even in Europe, it's not as significant as it was in the US. So that's something that's, I think, pretty striking. It also shows the limitations of the movement in the US, that we could not have Sanders as another, they could not have Sanders as the candidate ended up with someone like Biden. But before that, I'd quickly say that there were worldwide movements. There was 350.org, which was having sort of periodic worldwide protests around the climate question. So I think those are sort of significant shifts. And in India too, there are some shifts happening, but they are sort of piecemeal. Getting back to your question about India and what structural changes are possible. So there's a lot of debate about this, and primarily a debate about, do we need coal? How much do we need coal? As you know, there are very wide range of issues. And I must say here that what I'm saying does not represent the teachers group as a group. In the group itself, there are different sort of perspectives. And I happened to be at a meeting of trade unions a couple of days ago, and there was an enormous resistance to, because many of them represent coal sector workers. And there was resistance to the idea that we're going to have this massive expansion, what's going to happen to the coal workers, etc. Structurally, what we need, as far as energy is concerned, solar and wind is still a very small part of our entire energy. Notwithstanding the solar expansion, we take our entire energy basket. It's still quite small. I don't think that we can avoid natural gas. And that's something that the climate movement needs to face up to. You can't have this jump from coal straight to solar and wind on the scale that it's just not possible. It's technically not possible. All right. So what we need is a faster expansion of natural gas. A lot of our gas comes from Qatar, right? We need to be enabled to come from a whole range of places. And now, like I was saying earlier, because of technological advancements and you can import gas through tankers, you can have that expansion. That requires India to very quickly develop the gas distribution network and architecture, which incidentally has happened in Gujarat to a degree. So it's something that can happen in other states. So but that is as far as the energy sort of thing goes. So my point is that if we need to shift away from coal, it's not just climate change, but also air pollution. It kills lakhs of people every year in India and abroad. Therefore, let's sort of say that we do need that. That's one. Secondly, we need structural changes in certain key aspects, and particularly in urban areas. And that sort of links to a question that's already come up. So how do we have, because 70% of India's and the worldwide emissions come mainly from urban areas. So if you accept that's the case, so what are the kind of interventions that are needed in urban areas? I think is pretty important, which I'll talk about when responding to the question. And the third part is sort of social change. I mean, just look at the forced migration that happened following the lockdown. You can't have that kind of deepening inequality and expect people to cope with the impacts of climate change. You need to sort of prepare a lot more in advance. And that preparation has been very uneven. It was good in Kerala with the Kerala floods. It was good in Orissa, better at least than the super cyclone 1999. It was very bad in Uttarakhand. It was very bad in Kashmir. It was pretty poor in Tamil Nadu when the Tamil Nadu flood happens. It was terrible in Bombay when the Bombay flood happens. So I'm saying you need to prepare in advance. And some towns are doing that. There's sort of heat action plans taking place, but there needs to be a lot more done. So various kind of structural changes, I think, are possible, which can enable us to both have a faster transition, but we need to dialogue with the people impacted. They need to be part of the conversation. Workers and unions need to be part of that conversation. Other people need to be part of the conversation as well.
I don't want to monopolize. I can keep on asking. But so Dr. Karan Singh, sir, if anytime you want to jump in or ask, please feel free to do that. We have three questions posed on the chat, and one you mentioned. I think Ruchira and Nagraj, you can both see them, right? Can you see the question?
Yes, the first 2 3 years.
The third question, which you just briefly referred to, Nagraj, about urban pollution, and I saw Ruchira nodding to that idea of urban emissions. And of course, this is Delhi-centric, but about urban pollution, I mean, what kind of things is it possible? What immediate steps is saying you can take? Anybody, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah,
sorry. If I may just pitch in a little more, because Delhi context, the farm fires and climate change are not unconnected because of the sowing cycles and everything, but somehow we don't make the connection to climate change when the discourse is becoming. We are still looking at the discourse in very symptomatic and corrective ways, but not in structural ways. So would you like to react to that idea of climate change for urban pollution? And Ruchira, if you'd like to jump in at any point in time or follow it.
Yeah, firstly, I think that it's a mistake for Arvind Kejriwal to blame the farmers. If we look at sort of Delhi pollution averaged out through the year, it's pretty bad at non-harvest times as well. And one reason that you have so much pollution from harvesting, a lot of people have argued that Punjab need not grow the kind of crops it does. You can shift millets, etc. And it's part of that change from manual harvesting to using sort of machines, etc. But the more important point of the question is what steps can one do? We're talking more specifically, both in urban areas and general, there are three sectors from which urban emissions emanate. It's one from electricity, second from public transport, and obviously from construction. These are three, that's what studies have shown, right? So regarding each of the three, regarding transport, one, there needs to be higher taxes for sort of make a disincentive for people to take out their cars. Secondly, there need to be more buses. And particularly the time of COVID, when you want working people to go around from point A to point B, where they want to work, you need to have far, far more buses than are currently plying in places like Delhi, Bombay, and remember, in Bombay, there are no local trains operating. So you need to have far, far more buses. As far as electricity goes, a very large section is electricity use. So how do us on both one sort of limit consumption, particularly from air conditioning, which is a very large part of urban emissions. So both in terms of improving standards and both in terms of also reducing air conditioning use is one thing. The second part about Delhi is a lot of the pollution comes from polluting coal plants around. And that's very uneven because some of those coal plants are very, very old. How do you tackle them? Because it's expensive for them to sort of implement the kind of measures that are needed, right? And the third part in the urban context, I think, is water harvesting. I mean, any town in North and Northwest India, as you know, Ravi, is facing a very deep crisis of groundwater. And there's sort of a lot of data which shows how groundwater is plummeting. So that is an issue that will also generate employment. Because in expanding the water harvesting infrastructure in Delhi or in other areas, you have the capacity to generate a lot of jobs. And that I think is extremely important at this time, at the time of sort of COVID and the economic crisis. I think that an environmental question has to face the jobs question. So it's sort of these measures, and I can talk more. I don't want to hog the time.
Yeah. Ruchira, you mentioned in your presentation that the carbon tax in Australia did not last very long. It lasted the one term. It's obviously taxation, as Nagraj suggests, is not a popular measure at all. So then, how would you react structurally to urban pollution?
Look, I think, I mean, in the Australian context, I have to say, I mean, there is a level of politicization of, kind of any issue anywhere, because you think it's basically about power. But in Australia, the issue of climate action and basically any kind of power being taken away from the resource sector is an extremely politicized issue. So the pushback to the carbon tax and the way it was repealed is probably an extreme case, I would say, in the world, really. And there are many other issues about how the communication strategy was done, and so on and so forth. But it was, as I said, it was a climate war, and Australia has that. And that is basically the industry and how it plays off one party against the other, or basically has both parties in its pockets. I actually have in Australia, what has happened, and this is always, I don't know too much about the range of different measures in terms of urban solar, kind of household solar in India. But I see that this is something that's extensively done in Australia. And there are a range of schemes and incentives given by state governments and even kind of city level councils and so on and so forth. And it just kind of always in my mind raises the question about, and maybe this is a question I'll throw back at Nagraj in terms of, are there states, are there cities who are, kind of doing good in terms of encouraging middle class, upper middle class households in terms of, solarizing their power? Because that's, obviously one area where India can do so much in the urban space across cities, regardless of the.
I remember some time ago, I think probably in his first term, the Prime Minister launched something called the Surya Mandala, sort of worldwide solar, organization. In which a lot of people came and certain pledges were made. Has anybody ever heard of that? Has that taken off, or did that have no? Naga?
International Solar Alliance?
Sorry?
Are you referring to the International Solar Alliance?
Yes, the Solar Alliance, that's it. That's what I'm referring to. What happened to that? Is that on or is that not on?
I think
Who
it
knows?
is. It is carrying on. It's got its yes. Yes. There is.
That is to my layman. I think solar energy ultimately is what's going to save us. But maybe I'm so that solar alliance. I don't know. I never heard of it after it was launched. So maybe one of those years it didn't take off, but I think we should follow that up. Somebody should follow that up. There's no article on solar alliance as far as I can see in our journal this time. Is there? Ravi, is there any article on the solar alliance?
No, it exists, but maybe it's not very much talked about, or I don't know. I've not seen much it mentioned, but very much. You're right. Yeah, no, it's absolutely. There are two more questions on the chat, which I think we should take up because people have taken the trouble to ask them. Very important questions. One is from Dharani Rajasingham from Sri Lanka, and I'll read the question. My question is on the environmental cost of militarization and the Malabar War Games in particular on environment in the South Asia and the Indian Ocean region last week. So it is linking to the idea of militarization and climate change and the impact militarization generally has on it's like a contradiction of terms. At one time we're talking of climate change. So would anybody, any of the panelists like to react to that? Nagraj?
Okay, so responding sort of more broadly to questions of militarization, and so as far as well, when I put it this way, I would be competent to sort of respond to this question in a very specific way. So Ruchira wishes to, she's welcome to. More broadly, the environmental costs of militarization itself happen in 2 or 3 ways. So one is the use of fossil fuel energy in the entire military industrial complex, which primarily is to do with oil use in sort of running planes and running other tanks, other kinds of machines, and also the embedded use of fossil fuels and kind of manufacturing them, because a lot of them use aluminium, which is extremely energy intensive. The second part about the military industrial complex and fossil fuels environment in general is the fact that a lot of the resource wars, essentially wars, are carried out, as you know, in Iraq or other places, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and so on, is essentially to try to tap and corner resources. Regarding the environment cost of militarization, there's apparently been some work on what the environmental cost of there being a very large, armed forces presence, Indian armed forces presence in a number of places, and what the environmental damage might be. There have been people from Kashmir who have written about this, but I'm not familiar with the literature, so I don't wish to talk about something that I'm not familiar with. But this is, I think, a very important question. I would also say that it's something that, of which, typically speaking, the data is not very sort of transparent as far as what the environment, ecological, and climate change impacts of these, the military industrial complex in general.
Thank you, Nagraj. There's a question from Pratik from Ponda, and maybe Ruchira, you might want to take this up. I'll read. What are your views on the situation in Goa regarding the 3 projects that cut straight through the Molam Forest Reserve? And also about increased chance of import of coal now that we've already crossed the limit of 15 million tons to 25 million tons annually. So, of course, there's a local impacts and exporting the impacts, getting them from Australia. This is a constant tension across many natural resource issues, actually.
There is so I'll be honest, I'm not across I'm not very much across the technical details in terms of, we haven't crossed the limit, but basically there are bigger structural questions. So one of the, this much I know, that in Australia, all the analysts have been, basically tying themselves up in knots about India's position on coal. So one has to do with import, So Australia exporting coal to India, the other is about India's domestic increase in coal extraction. And there have been different conflicting kind of, policy statements and approaches and so on and so forth. But structurally, globally, coal is on the decline. So one of the issues with setting up such massive coal infrastructure and transforming the landscape and affecting other industries in a state like Goa, kind of with significant impacts on biodiversity, is what it does for the future. Because in the future, we might not be bringing in so much coal through those regions, and then what happens to all the infrastructure they set up? These are very new infrastructures of coal. These are new coal regions in India, as opposed to Singrauli, which is old. And kind of setting up infrastructure on a massive scale now has significant impacts for the future. So they might not necessarily bring in coal; they might be doing other things. But what does it mean for the forests that are cut down and the basically everything that is set up, and then people who are employed, and then they lose jobs. So it's a bigger structural question, and none of that really gets asked in the political conflict that happens because of, people in Goa are protesting. And that's probably one example of where urban and rural and indigenous and many other issues have come together. And Goa has that legacy from the time of, Save the Western Ghats movement and so on and so forth. So that is a very interesting space to look at. But in the political conflict, the bigger structural questions don't get asked. And what will all this infrastructure do in the future? Because, even if India doesn't wean itself away from coal over a period of time, overall the trade will decline. So, yeah.
I just like to... Yes, sir.
I was just saying it may be useful to compare the manifestos of the major Indian political parties on this issue. So I'm certain that as far as the Congress is concerned, because of Indira Gandhi and because all we were involved in this very deeply, I'm sure that the Congress manifesto at least must be mentioning this whole business of climate change. I'm not quite sure about the other manifestos. I know manifestos don't always work, but it would be interesting to revisit them and to see whether or not they contain anything about climate change. I'm almost certain that the Congress manifesto will contain that, although I haven't read it for many years now. Just an idea.
Thank you. I'll just ask one question, and I think then we're probably running out of time. And my question is to do about embedding the idea of climate change in development policy. And what does that imply? For example, we just had the Bihar elections, and from what I saw on television, jobs was a very big issue. There's a very big issue there. Now, when we think of jobs, we of course think of jobs, and we talk of the classical model of industrialization. But do we think of green jobs? So what will it take? And Biden talked about green jobs in his presidential acceptance speech, or whatever that speech was about, and where the fracking issue also comes up. What would it take for that kind of structural shift, where it also segues in what Dr. Karan Singh is saying about it being a political imperative of development, of survival. And these are not separate issues. The moment we talk of climate change as separate from development imperative, we come to almost a non-starter, become at something which is really not a mainstream thrust. How do we integrate this better? What would it take to integrate this better? Is it a question of cost? Is it a question of focus and political will? Or is it just a question of how politically we understand the question itself? Would you like to both react to that, Ruchira and Nagraj?
Yeah, can I go first? Yeah. So just a couple of responses. So one is there have been studies that show, for instance, there was a paper in the EPW by Robert Paulin and Shovik Chakravarti a couple of years ago, which showed that the jobs potential from solar and other renewables is higher than that from coal. So they have this data for India and there's data for the US as well. And that's partly why Biden's talking of the Green New Deal and jobs, is that you can potentially generate more jobs by having a certain capacity in solar and wind than you can if there was a comparable capacity in coal. So that's something that I think is a point that I think should be taken forward and amplified. However, the challenge is that the area where the mining happens in India, which primarily is in central India and eastern India nowadays, and elsewhere, but whereas the solar and the wind are primarily coming up in Gujarat, in Tamil Nadu, and other places. My point is that the jobs that are being lost is in one region, and the jobs that are being gained would be in another region, and with other sort of social forces. How do you actually balance the two? And there are policy institutes, research institutes, and other people who are sort of saying that we need to have sort of post-coal plans in place so that one can make sure that the energy transition, because it will happen, that energy transition does not damage sort of people and communities in areas where coal is sort of prevalent. So one part is that. The second part is I think that a lot of job potential is possible in the adaptation area of climate change. So I mentioned water harvesting in urban areas. I think you can have a massive expansion of the NREGA in both in rural areas and have an urban NREGA, be able to cushion the impacts of climate change. And I think these are some things where I think a lot of social actors, including unions, might be interested. Having said that, I think you're absolutely right. That at the end of the day, we have to sort of challenge this sort of development jobs question. But there are people who've talked about, different areas of reviving agriculture, of reviving livelihoods. There's a lot of literature about this from a number of people, which are sort of employment, where there is employment generation cost. To me, the challenge is what do we do in urban areas? Because say if I say buses and if you want fewer cars, I have to admit that cars is a massive employment generator. How do one sort of take up those challenges? But the key broader question is what kind of development trajectory do we want? We can't simply continue, even those who might be pro-coal. The fact of the matter is, we can't simply continue on the kind of development trajectory that we've had for the last 50, 60 years. It's clearly so deeply damaging at so many levels. Not just about climate change, but just look at air pollution as an issue. Look at other issues. It's just massive, and the way it's impacting communities that Ruchira talked about. So I would say we need a very serious rethinking of our development trajectory, which I think both the climate crisis and COVID forces us to do if people are ready to do it.
Thank you. Ruchira?
I don't have any specifics, but I'll just respond to just add to a couple of things Nagraj said. So yes, I mean, I agree that there's the whole question of the pathway of transition in India is going to be an extremely messy and painful one because the regions are entirely different. Like in Australia, because it's completely open to the global market, communities and regions of coal mining have been transitioning themselves for a very long time, whether governments want it or not, because they are in direct touch with the market and the market itself is changing. Whereas in India, it's an entirely different situation politically, every which way, socioeconomically. And the regions of solar and wind and the regions of coal are entirely different. So it's going to create all kinds of economic justice issues and hardships. But on the other hand, there is, I mean, this is just at a broad narrative level, really. The thing is that, I mean, we've had this question and we've kind of talked about this in so many different ways. In India, we are reinventing the paradigm of green jobs, where if just securing livelihoods is actually being able to guarantee green jobs in a way. And like state governments or the federal or the national government doesn't necessarily seriously deal with this because we are losing more livelihoods based kind of community ways of living than we are securing them, and that in itself is a problem. I mean, political possibilities are raised when Adivasi communities, indigenous communities fight for their rights, and they vote on the basis of the fact that they didn't get forest rights. But then once governments come in, then nothing really moves on the ground. And those kinds of shifts in politics and kind of new governments come in at chances when something can change. But in India, those kinds of momentums peter out. In terms of political will, I think those are the formative points. Like we saw that in Chhattisgarh, we saw that in Jharkhand with the state elections. And so much of it was on the grounds of forest rights. And then, of course, nothing really changes. So it's very complex in terms of political change and ingraining, kind of securing livelihoods or securing, kind of environmental sustainability within a political agenda. But at the same time, I guess, kind of a focus on securing livelihoods rather than destroying them through development ought to be a central focus. I know that's kind of broad, but it's a...
Thank you. Thank you. We are at the time slot ending now, and Dr. Karan, I will invite Dr. Karan Singh. Would like to say some final words, sir?
I have nothing original to say. I have enjoyed the discussion. I'm very glad that some major points have been taken up, particularly the developmental philosophy vis-a-vis of the environment. I think that is central and crucial, because the political leadership is what really does it. I remember I was in the cabinet for 10 years, and she was extremely involved in environmental presentation. Now, I'm not quite sure how our present Prime Minister is. I don't know whether he spoke. I think he has spoken about it in some of his sort of Mann Ki Baat. But nonetheless, I think it's very useful that this meeting is taking place. I hope we'll carry it on. Ruchira, I just want to tell you, I've been to Ayers Rock and to Hamilton Island both.
Both great places, yeah.
In Australia. Thank you all very much. I think that's it. Thank you, Ravi. You've done a very good job on this. So,
thank you. Thank you, Ruchira. Thank you, Nagraj. Thank you, Dr. Karan Singh. Thank you, everybody.
And congratulations once again, Ravi. Congratulations.
Thank you, and to Omita too, and to the IIC team. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Yes, thank you.